Would you guys all give them a welcome of applause? And
I started a blog recently, although it's been a while since I've done it. It's www.thechemistryofbeer.com with the word "the" in. Anyhow, so the last thing I posted on was Disaccharides. Here's an article on the chemistry of diacetyl, which I'll explain. So if you want to know more about diacetyl, just go to my blog, including how to pronounce it. And that's not at all something obvious. All right, so Zymurgy is the art or science of brewing, specifically beer, and it's the same Greek root word as enzyme. Okay, so some of the early research in biochemistry was fermentation, and zyme means to work. And if you ever see a fermentation, you can actually see it moving around.
Beer. This is Christ, which any fool can eat, but for which the Lord intended a more divine means of consumption. Let us give praise to our Maker and glory to His bounty by learning about beer.
Prior to that from Oxford. Yeah, I have a lot of different hats beer-wise. So I'm a certified beer judge. I teach classes on how to judge beer occasionally. I guess I'm going to do it again soon. It's about 13 weeks, about 3 hours every, say, Monday night or something like that. With the Birmingham Brewmasters, the homebrew club, free the hops and that sort of thing. And so I'm going to go ahead and start about the origin of beer. So well, beer is an agriculture product. So they've analyzed grain that they found. It's 13,000 years old. And they discovered it was a type of grain that couldn't grow wild, so it must have been domesticated. So man's been domesticating grain ever since we came out of the last ice age, which is, you can see the global temperature with the black line here. So the glaciers retreated about 10,000 BC, or 10,000 years before present, sorry. And last year's temperature was here, just to give you an idea of where things are going. So barley's a fairly recent, and grass, as a matter of fact, is a kind of a young biological organism. Grass itself has only existed about 50 to 100 million years. So it's, as plants go, it's a pretty recent invention. And it's very abrasive. You have to have special teeth to graze. Otherwise, it'll just wear most of the thing's teeth down. But in the grass family, wheat, rye, and barley, they are closely related in this Triaceae family. And then a little more distant cousins are oats and rice, which are used in making beer as well sometimes. And so that's what the picture up at the top is. It would look just like wheat to you. Okay, barley does, has a husk and all sorts of things. The other part, main ingredient in beer is hops. That's what gives the bitterness and a lot of interesting flavors. It's related to a different kind of grass. Its closest relative is cannabis. Yeah. So how did beer get discovered? Well, it was an accident, okay? But as with all accidents, you know, it's lost in the mists of history. Nobody knows what the oldest fermented beverage is anyway. So people made up stories. And so, but you know, back then they were cultivating grain. Some people would argue that the main reason they did that was to make beer. But if you grow grain, it enables you to stay in one place. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you hunt and fish, you kind of eat up most of the food that's there, and you have to move somewhere else, which means you can't live in a city. So the only way to have cities is to have high energy density food, and that's starch. And once you have agriculture, then you have to store the grain because you can't eat it all at once. And that means you have warehouses, and that means you have to have records of how much is yours, how much deposit and withdrawal, and things like that. So that means you have accountants, mathematics, writing, priests, and of course, with, you know, whoever doing management, of course, they weren't producing grain, they were eating it, right? They were eating your grain. So, they actually didn't store the grain. What they did was they made this kind of local bread out of it called batter. And then they baked these up, and this is actually described in a hymn to Ninkasi, which was the goddess of beer in Babylonia. Okay? And so they make this bread. Then when they're ready to brew beer, they throw it in some water, let it get wet, and spontaneously ferment by whatever's floating in from the air. They didn't even bother to separate the solid stuff from the liquid. And but they knew that if you drank it, it produced intoxication. So they actually drank the beer through a straw from these urns. It was a very social occasion. Okay, notice this person is not drinking by themselves, which is sad. Right? It's a social occasion. So Great Lakes actually reproduced this beer, and they didn't do it to sell it or anything. It was only for themselves, just to see how it turned out if they followed these instructions. And there it is, cloudy, murky, sour. This is compared to their current product, which is an excellent beer, by the way. If you ever have a chance to go to Great Lakes Brewing in Cleveland, you should do so. They have one of their beers is called Burning River Pale Ale. It's in memory of when the river caught fire in Cleveland. So beer went from Mesopotamia over to Egypt pretty quick because the Egyptian empire starts to go on the rise, and they were also based on beer. Now, Tanana was the Egyptian goddess of childbirth and beer. This might be a natural association that could occur. And we know it's true because there's hieroglyphs that show the process of consuming beer in Egypt. Okay? So, there's actually been people who've analyzed traces of residues found in these urns, find out what ingredients they use to make these beverages. So one of the first ones that they did was dogfish head, which has just started to distribute in Alabama, so you can now buy this probably. Is Midas Touch, and it's got a lot of honey and saffron and other things, muscat grapes. It's actually an interesting little beverage. I know you're not old enough. They also made one here, in case you can't read the hieroglyphics, dog, fish, head, beer. Okay? And again, that's made from yeast actually they got from the air in Egypt. Now they didn't just use any old yeast, they probably, got a whole bunch of them and picked or selected the one that produced the best beer. Alright, so here's how you make beer. You make some sugar water and you add some yeast, and that's it. Beer occurs. Okay? So the sugar gets converted to carbon dioxide and alcohol, 2 of each, or 1 glucose. And if you want a stronger beer, you use a stronger concentration of sugar. Now, not just any old sugar. I mean, you could, but the best sugar for brewing is called maltose. Okay? And it comes from malted barley. And so we'll talk about that in a bit. But you can measure the density of the solution. You can get an idea how much sugar there is. The more sugar you dissolve, the more dense the liquid's going to be. And they actually measure the density, but they don't call it density. They call it specific gravity. It's a unitless quantity, but basically it's also the same as the density. Okay? They talk about specific gravity. So 1.050 would be about 5% weight per sugar. Okay? 5% more dense than water, it's about 5% weight per sugar. So as the sugar gets converted to alcohol, the density goes down because there's less sugar. And the density also goes down because alcohol is less dense than water. Okay? So that's why it's called apparent attenuation. It's apparently going down in density because the sugar's being consumed, but also because of the alcohol. But there's a device where you measure the density by how high something floats in it. Okay, it's just like, you go to the Dead Sea, you're supposed to be able to float a lot higher than you can in regular water because it's so salty and dense that you float high. So there's a device called a hydrometer that does this. And you take the difference between when you started and when you finished, and it gives you a little formula to convert to percent alcohol. That's how the brewers actually around town report their alcohol. They know how much they should get from the sugar they started with, the sugar they ended with. They don't actually analyze percent alcohol. Okay? But that's going to be a very, as far as you're concerned or anybody else, it's accurate enough to know how much alcohol is in there. So, but not all the sugar gets fermented. There's always some unfermentable sugars. These are the more complex sugars. You have 3, 4, or more sugar glucose units hooked together. And so there's always going to be residual sweetness in beer. The old-time fermentations, maybe only 60% of the sugars got converted to alcohol, and about 40% of the sugar was left. It'd be very heavy bodied, sweet, and not at all what you would recognize in beer today. So modern fermentation goes down and to about 25% of sugar. So it's quite clear which beer is sweeter is the old style. And the question is why? Well, yeast is not that much different, although we have been selecting yeast for its desirable properties. Okay? So if you want to make a good beer, you use a beer yeast. You don't want to use a bread yeast. It can be done, but it's nasty. Right? And sometimes if you have a high alcohol beer, you want it to go very dry, you might use a wine yeast. Wine yeast can tolerate high alcohol. But generally speaking, yeast at some point, when the alcohol gets up to some level, just kind of shuts down. Okay? And so different strains will shut down at different alcohol concentrations. So when you have a beer like a barley wine, well, you need a lot of yeast because a lot of them are going to go to sleep along the way to fermenting all that sugar into lots and lots of alcohol. And but there's still going to be a lot of residual sugars because the yeast, just can't process it all because of all the alcohol and sugar and all this other stuff. It's a high osmotic stress. Okay, so there's so much of stuff in solution outside it produces an osmotic pressure difference between inside and outside the yeast cell that it has to deal with. All right, so in the old days, they didn't even know what yeast was. So when you look at the German purity law, it doesn't mention yeast at all. It says what you can have in beer is water, hops, and barley. 3 things. Okay, now they've added yeast actually to the law because they know that's what's in there, doing the fermentation, and that's the law except for exceptions and all that stuff. Okay, so when they started making German wheat beers, that was obviously a violation of Reinheitsgebot because it was using wheat and not barley. But the ruler of Germany happened to grant a monopoly exception to the one person who could make that beer. And that person, by coincidence, was himself. That's how these things work. Okay? So, not a bad idea. All right, but in England, before they knew what yeast was, they actually called it God is good. Oh, by the way, women did a lot of brewing until it became business. It was, just like cooking or whatever. It was a household chore. And the medieval times and in the Middle Ages in England, 1 out of 12 houses in England would sell beer out the door. So imagine that. You know, you live in this neighborhood, and if there's more than 12 houses there, somebody there is selling beer. You just go knock on their door, hold out your growler, and pay them some money, and you know, that's unimaginable nowadays, right? No, you gotta have licenses and all that stuff. All right, so those beers were all ales until lager yeast was kind of discovered, and there's a lot of research done on where lager yeast came from, but it's probably also a cross between some other yeasts. And anyhow, this particular yeast would actually work even at low temperatures. If you try to ferment an ale at a cold temperature, it just, all the kinetic processes are so slow, the yeast just kind of clump together, fall about them, and nothing happens. Okay? But lager yeast, even though it's cold, the fermentation is going to be slow because all the kinetics at low temperature, all the kinetics of all these reactions are slow. Okay? So it takes a long time to make a lager. It takes a month to make a lager. That means if you're in a small brewery, your tank is going to be tied up for a month, whereas if you make an ale, it's only tied up for a week. But you can make 4 times as much ale as you can lager. So what are they going to make? They're going to make the stuff that gets them their investment back. Budweiser, on the other hand, they're not limited by their equipment. They're limited by the number of people they can convince to drink beer through advertising. Okay? And there's a limit there, right? There's only so much beer America can drink. All right, although we try. Lagers were known in the 15th century, although not very widely spread. In Germany, mostly Bavaria, made these dark lagers like Bach's. And Bach's are delicious, but they're very malty. And they're dark. Now, in 1842, all right, 1842, there was this brewery in Czechoslovakia called Pilsen. Well, the town was called Pilsen. Brewery, I don't know even if it had a name, but it was the brewery in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. So they had this lager yeast. They were having trouble because basically they made bad beer and nobody would buy it. So they made no money, so they cut corners, which made the beer even worse. So they hired an outside expert to turn things around, and he did. And but he actually made this very light beer that you would recognize as very similar. Well, it's called Pilsner or Urquell, and you can still buy it. Getting it fresh may be a little bit difficult, but it's still made, and it's still very popular. It's just a picture of my wife talking to one of her friends. All right, so home brewing in Alabama has been legal since May 9th, 2013, about 7 p.m. So it was the end of the legislative season, and we'd just given up all hopes of that bill being passed. And then all of a sudden, I think maybe one of the critics of the bill must have had to go to the bathroom. And so this thing comes up to the floor, it's passed, and so I don't know who it was, but somebody knew what they were doing. That's one way to get things done in Congress. Now, of course, sometimes, they've actually done things in Congress where, they can't leave, so they, just keep this jug, by the desk in case they have to go to the bathroom. It's been known to happen. All right, well, anyhow, in those days, I did this talk, and I talked as if it was my friend who was brewing. That's me. I don't know if you can tell. But I made a promise I would not make fun of the legislature if they would pass this bill. So, no Alabama legislature joke. All right, so that's a mill. It's not a very good picture. But the first step is you take grain and you grind it up into bits. Now, it cannot be barley. It has to be malted barley. So that's the whole point. If you take barley from the field, grind it up, and try to make beer, nothing happens. Okay? There's no enzymes in there that'll do the magic that you need to do. So you have to malt the barley, which means you take the barley and you start to germinate it. So when a seed goes in the ground, it just sits there until it senses enough moisture. Says, hey, I got water, I've got dirt, I can grow. Okay, so there's a signal pathway. It upregulates all the enzymes to break down protein, break down starch, because that's what's in the seed. And what it needs is simple amino acids and simple carbohydrates to build whatever the plant needs. All right, so the malt maker does this to the point where you get the enzymes but not the plant. Okay? So it's a very tricky sort of process because it doesn't happen all through the seed all at the same place at the same time. It starts at one end and it kind of grows all the way to the other. It's not grows, but modifies all the way to the other. Then maybe you get a little bit of roots on the end, but you stop it, you dry it out, and now you have something. And when you put it in hot water, it will produce sugar. Okay, because the enzymes that get made during the germination process will break down starch to sugar. All right, so the starch to sugar is the biggie for brewers. In the old days, brewers had to worry about protein to amino acids because it turns out yeast cannot eat steak, okay? They have to have amino acids and not protein. So, but there's enough amino acid during this process now that you don't have to worry about it. Too much. Now, if you read my diacetyl column, you'll have to figure out, okay, there needs to be at least a certain level of valine, otherwise some nasty things happen. All right, so, and I'll show you another process where amino acids and hops actually get used to make some of the hop compounds. But, starches. So, but if you do a high protein grain adjunct like wheat, in addition to barley, then you might want to do something with all that protein. Okay, so you may put the mixture of hot water and the grain, which is called the mash. I'll show you a picture in a minute. At a certain temperature for the proteins to break to amino acids, and then another temperature for the starch that goes to sugar. Okay. And I'll show you all these temperatures, pH and tolerance. This is an oatmeal stout. That's roast barley. And this is flaked barley. Usually I would use oats, but for some reason I was using flaked barley. You can tell from the picture I've been brewing a while. At least my camera thinks it's 2001. All right, so brewing is a very messy process. I'll show you the messes. And it's also very smelly. So if you ever go to a brewery when they're brewing, you can really smell some interesting. I think they're great, but my daughter, when she was growing up, and my son didn't care for the smell, particularly of the hops, but just the whole thing. And so they bought me this and said, take it outside. My driveway. This is an NSF certified thermometer. All right. Most brewers don't have one of those. Right. I'm going to show you a bunch of equipment of questionable provenance. All right. So as far as you're concerned, you just buy the malted barley. You put in some hot water. You use this little program that tells you how much hot water at what temperature. And using Q equals MC delta T, that's what it does. Uses specific heat calculation to calculate how much grain, how much water, what temperature of the grain, what temperature of the water, and you can calculate the final temperature from the heat lost by the water equals the heat gained by the grain, blah, 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 blah. My head is All right, so the water has to be hot enough to actually gelatinize starch. Okay, so starch is kind of very rigid. You actually need to turn it to kind of something soft and gooey. Okay, so that the water can get inside the starch granule and hydrate it, so that it'll expand and get broken down to the enzymes. Now I'm going to do this inside of a water cooler. Okay. This cooler was donated by the Hoover Track team. Again, they didn't know about that. But I knew one of the parents who actually volunteered for it. So actually they were getting new ones. So he asked me if I wanted one of the old ones. But unlike the Mesopotamians, I'm going to separate the grain from the sugar water with a simple screen here at the bottom. And there's a valve on the side you really can't see very well. All right, so pH. You don't have to go crazy about pH. If you follow the instructions and have reasonably decent water, the pH of beer will turn out like it should, and everything will work just fine. When the Germans tried to copy Pilsner Urquell, this light lager, they tried to make light lager. They all failed, okay? Because the German water was more basic, more alkaline than the Pilsen water. Pilsen water is a lot like Birmingham water, very soft. German water was very much like up in Kentucky, you know, where they have lots of limestone, high carbonate levels in their water. Okay, it's good for horses and stuff, and it's good for you know, whiskey and stuff like that. But so I'm adding carbonate, so the final pH will turn out okay. So the reason the Germans couldn't make a dark light lager with basic water is because, well, they couldn't make a light lager with basic water. It's because the pH would go too high. But acidic grains, dark grains, are actually more acidic than light ones. Okay, so that's why they only have to. If you're going to make a dark beer around here, you got to add some calcium carbonate. And then just a tablespoon. There's the final. All right, so the reason you go to this trouble for pH and temperature is because the enzymes operate best under a certain temperature, pH. All right? So these are the two biggies for the carbohydrate conversion. There's two enzymes, one called beta amylase, one called alpha amylase. You can say they operate at different temperatures. Beta can run at lower temperatures, alpha at higher temperatures. So you can actually control your sugar composition by the temperature at which you run this mash. All right? If you run at low temperature, beta amylase does all the work, and you get mostly maltose, which is 2 glucose sugar units. It's a disaccharide. If you run at high temperature, you get stuff that's more like just random chopping of bits. Okay, so you get all different sizes. And that leaves a lot more unfermentable sugar. Right? This is what you would do for protein degradation if you had to do it. This is what you'd use for a pumpkin beer. The best advice for pumpkin beer is don't do it. Because nobody can taste the pumpkin anyway. It's the pumpkin spice that they're expecting. You know, the cinnamon, the nutmeg. They don't care about the pumpkin. Right? Or sweet potatoes, that all right, so the pH range is 5 to 5.5. So the sweet spot pH of beer is about 5.3, 5.2, something like that. And you can actually purchase a buffer at 5.2 if you really want to make sure your pH is 5.2. Use a buffer. Just the naming of enzymes. If it's an ACE, it breaks whatever ACE it is. So glucanases break down glucanates. Amylases break down amylose. The amylopectin protease breaks down proteins. So I got to show you glucose. Okay, so I know there's a lot of organic 2 students in here. Yeah. Have you studied carbohydrates? Have you? Have you? No. Well, you know about the Fisher projection for sugar, right? it's got 6 carbons. And then, of course, the stereochemistry is determined by if the hydroxyl is over here or here. And the other thing is the open form is in equilibrium with a ring form. Okay? And so you hydrolyze this guy right here, you get the open form. And when you hydrolyze here, it's a condensation basically, right? Condensation reaction with an alcohol and an aldehyde, right? Is that aldol condensation? Perhaps, I don't know. I'm not an organic chemist. It sounds like it. So, but carbon 1 is where the aldehyde is, right? CHO. That will reduce silver plus to a silver mirror. It's called the Tollens test. So that's called the reducing carbon, right? And the other end, where most of the time, so most of the polymerization between one sugar and another happens carbon 1, carbon 4. Okay, so this is the non-reducing carbons. Number 1 is reducing. All right. Now, when you do this glucose in the open form, it turns out the ring can close in 2 different stereochemistries, right? Enantiomers, basically, there's beta and alpha D-glucose. All right, I'm going to have to keep these straight here. This is the alpha D-glucose and the beta D-glucose. So it's just an artifact which way the aldehyde is turned when condensed with the alcohol, right? All right, so one of these you will find in starch and the other not. Okay? Now in the solid form, it turns out, from crystal packing and other things, that we get for starch all the alpha D-glucose. And the D just refers to the fact that it's dextrorotary. It rotates plane polarized like clockwise. Okay? Which is the good way, right? This bad is good. Right? So, all right. Now, you also have linkages between carbon 1 and carbon 6. Okay? Those are called 1,6 links. But most of them are 1,4s. And not only that, but the 1,4 links are such that, I've got to show you. So if you have a highly branched, it's called pectin, right? Pectin is highly branched. It really forms these networks with water, become highly entangled. That's how jellies set. Yeah. So there's a lot of pectin in apples and other things. Whereas something like potato starch, that's highly linear. Potato starch is highly fermentable. Rice as well, rice starch is highly fermentable. No problem chewing that up. All right, so let's go to the disaccharides. This is the maltose. Okay, glucose, glucose. Both are alpha D-glucose. And the reason you can tell is because the OH is at the, I have to turn these a little bit, equatorial position, and so it's kind of hard to see the way it's been. But the other thing is the glucose units kind of form a natural bend. So it turns out when you make a long chain of these things, they have a curl to them. Okay? Not that you can really notice that sharp. So this is just the way that they're labeled. But this particular stereochemical linkage here, where where the oxygen's down, below the ring, and below the ring, that's called the alpha linkage. This is the one the enzyme can hydrolyze, add water, and produce OH-OH. Okay? If you have the other link where the oxygen's above the 2 chairs, that's called the beta link. That is cellobiose. Basically, to repeat this forever, you get cellulose. Cellulose is more like linear. Okay? It's kind of like corrugated cardboard, you might say, at a small level. And very few critters can digest cellulose directly. Termites can, and so can their symbiotic bacteria. So that's the beta linkage. All right, so then there's one more sugar I want to talk about. That's table sugar. So when you buy, well, first of all, you don't have to use grain and all this stuff to make beer. You need a lot of equipment, big burner, lots of room. You don't have. If you want to start beer, don't start there. What you can do is actually buy the sugar solution already made. Okay? Now it's mostly dehydrated or completely dehydrated. So it'll look like something like honey or just a dry powder. And you just add water to bring it back to what I would get after about 3 or 4 hours. Okay? A lot of waiting time making a beer. Okay? So this stuff is kind of expensive. It's like $4 a pound. It's not terribly expensive. But table sugar is like 50 cents a pound. So a lot of the cans come with a little packet of yeast under the label, the cap of the can. Throw that away, get some good yeast. Then it says add 1 can and then so much sugar. Well, generally you don't want to do that either. You want to add just 2 cans. Make a better beer, 2 cans rather than 1 can plus a whole bunch of sugar. And the reason you don't want to do that is because if you do it with too much sugar and not enough malt extract, there's not enough amino acids for the yeast to have a very healthy life. And so what happens, your fermentation just kind of mumbles along at a very slow pace, produces a lot of cidery flavors that are not desirable. So go with an all malt beer if you can. Or once you become experienced enough, you know that you can manage your yeast, then you can add some sugar. All right, so now we've got sugar, water, and a bunch of grain. Now, sugar solutions are very sticky. You ever notice that? And the hotter they are, the less viscous they are. So if you have honey, it's kind of crystallized. You put it in the microwave carefully, and they'll become runnier and dissolve sugar and all this stuff. So if we use hot water, it'll dissolve the sugar better than cold water. But too hot, and it starts to dissolve tannins from the grain husks, and that's not good. Okay. And the other thing about using barley versus some of the other grains is barley has a husk on it that acts as a filter. Wheat does not have a husk, and so it won't be good at filtering, and that's more likely to lead to clogging, particularly if you try to, get the liquid out too fast. It creates a suction that compacts the grain, which of course makes things slower. All right, so you want to be careful about this. It comes out a little cloudy, it's a little particulate. It's not super important that you put them in the top and refilter, but it's just a general practice that people do. But I have a gravity system where I put hot water in the top and the wort out the bottom. This is a cutout keg. Again, I did not pay for that, with a deposit, then just not returned it. That happens a lot with kegs. Okay? It's against the law, it's not right. Because the breweries have to pay for that. And the deposit is not near as much as that. All right, so another filter to filter out some goop. I'm going to get it a bit at the end. That's what the oatmeal stout thing looks like when it's done. If you were to taste this stuff, it'd just be absolutely bland. Bland, bland, bland. No flavor at all. But it's fine for cows and stuff. Cows are not picky. They'll eat anything. And so this is good for cows. It's also good for making bread. So you can use this for spent grain for bread. That's very common. But anyhow, a lot of fiber in there. That's about it. All right, so now the sugar water's up. That's where you can buy the extract for and add water. So you have the sugar water. What are you going to do? You're going to boil it. There's many reasons you want to boil it. Okay. The reason I have to boil it is because I have 7 gallons of liquid I'm going to try to put into a 5-gallon jug. It's not going to work. I need to boil it down below 5 gallons. There's a lot of protein. It turns out barley is about 10% or so protein. And if you leave it all in there, then it's going to come out of solution when you put it in the refrigerator, because most things are less soluble at cold temperatures. So the beer will look clear. At room temperature, you put it in the fridge, it gets all hazy. All right? And that's just generally poor practice because it's unnecessary. All right? Now, beers can be hazy for other reasons. So, for example, if it's a wheat beer, there's high levels of protein in there. It's expected to be hazy from all the wheat proteins in there. Or if it's one of these New England style IPAs, it's going to be hazy because they put a pound of hops in there for every gallon. Some absolutely nuts amount. Okay? So if you get a hazy beer and it's real hoppy, that's okay too. But if you buy a Budweiser that's hazy, that's not good. Okay? Somebody messed up.
So I go with Miller.
All right, so the Maillard reaction occurs as you heat anything containing sugar and an amine group. Okay, first step is the condensation of the amine with the sugar, and you get amines and then polymerization, all sorts of stuff. That's where all your flavor comes from when you grill a steak. Okay. And bake bread, the crust, brown crust. All right, and so the Maillard reaction works better the less water there is. So if you want a super crispy steak, make sure there's no moisture on the surface of the steak. Okay, just pat it dry. There's a reason. You know, just cook yourself steak. Pat it dry. Okay, just get a really good grill mark on the thing. All right. All right, here's the main reason to boil it. You're trying to kill any competing organisms, like bacteria and so on, and you're trying to extract bittering compounds that lead to bitterness in the hops. And later on, maybe flavors from the hops, flavors and aromas. Okay? So if you want bitters from hops, you add it early in the boil for 60 minutes. If you want flavor and aroma, that's not going to be around after 60 minutes. It's going to be gone. So you have to add those real late before you stop boiling. At 5 minutes, or even after you turn it off, throw in the hops. Okay? Some people throw in hops all the time. So the Dogfish Head 90-minute IPA, the way they started doing it was say, put the hops on one of these electric football games, you know, the ones that kind of vibrate a little bit. So they put the hops on that and just let them vibrate off into the kettle continuously. That's how they made that first time. I'm sure they don't do it that way. All right, this green stuff is hops. This foam here is mostly a protein from the barley. And that will boil right out of there if you're not careful. So this is the danger spot. This is the one spot where you have to be there. Turn it down as quick as you can. All right, so this is what happened to my oatmeal stout when I was taking pictures and washing and all that stuff. Of course, it didn't have near as much headspace, but you know, can you imagine this sugary solution getting burned on your burner, in your stove, in your house? Yeah, not good. Okay? Very hard to clean off burnt sugar solution. All right, so when people see this, they think I'm making distilled alcohol. Right? And that's not condensation coil or anything like that. It's the world's ugliest heat exchanger. Okay? I run ice water through that to cool down the work after I boil. Okay? Because you can't put yeast in boiling liquid, it dies. So basically you boil it to kill the bacteria, but then you have to cool it down to room temperature or whatever temperature you want. Then add yeast. So I run ice water through using a pod pump and another pot with ice water in it. Works quite well. Now, you have to put this in while it's boiling or else there's germs on this stuff. So you got to put it in while it's boiling. About 15 minutes should do. All right, so hops. This is like one of the most important things you can put in beer. First known use of hops was in Germany, in Hamburg, in 850 AD. And up to then, all the flavorings that here had some residual sugar, it's going to be too sweet if you just drink it. So you have to balance the sweet with bitter. Okay? Now herbs are bitter. There's lots and lots of herbs. But hops are also bitter, or produce bitter compounds when you boil them. And they eventually took over. But it took a while because the people who sold the herbs didn't like the hops people muscling in on their business. Basically a Gruit mafia. Okay? Or the Gruit teamsters, or what do you want to call them? Right? So there was a lot of resistance, let's say that. And so a lot of misinformation, false news about hops. Right? So there's actually an article written by an Englishman, like 1500. He said, you know, you don't want hops in that English beer. You just look at those Dutch over there who drink beer with hops. They're all fat, and they got big red noses. It's a famous article, you know, so just shows you things really haven't changed. So, in England, the word beer was specifically meant to be an ale with hops added. Okay? If it didn't have hops, they would just call it ale. And now people use all these terms interchangeably, right? So when somebody says ale, it's a warm room temperature fermented beverage. Lager, cold fermented temperature beverage. Beer is just generic for anything with barley in it, barley and hops. But it used to be a more specific use. All right, so hops are a vine. So they grow from a root called a rhizome, and they shoot up from the ground about this time of year, and they'll climb 50 feet high if you let them. So these are grown on trellises, and I think up in the Northwest, they have these things go up 20 feet before they even go somewhere. But you can imagine it's pretty hard to pick with 20-foot one just standing on the ground. Right, so you got to have some way of harvesting them. Usually, what you do is you just cut the vines down, and you just gather them all, and pluck them by hand, although that's very inefficient as well, right? So you want some sort of machinery that would match your farm if you're on the commercial scale. So what's in hops varies a lot. So the hop variety has a huge effect on what your beer tastes like. So the reason hops actually took over from Gruit is not based on the flavor only, although that's a good reason. Hop bitterness is nice and clean, but it also inhibits bacteria. So it has some antibacterial properties. So they've actually done studies that people who drink hoppy beer have fewer cavities in their teeth. Right? So now you know how I brush my teeth. So this is a cross section of the cone. You know, it's the female flower. So most of the hop farms use female clones. Okay? They don't want in this male business kind of messing up their varieties, right? Because that's going to, you know, produce crosses and with unpredictable results. And most of the compounds are in these little granules. These are like resin granules, right? So if you ever see some pine trees that have this little resiny stuff in there, that's where most of some of the compounds are. Not so much the leaves. But you can buy these leaves whole, these cones whole, or you can buy them pressed. It has little rabbit-looking pellets. All right, so here's the hop resins. They're called alpha acids or humulones. So the Latin name is Humulus lupus, wolf plant. So humulones, and then there's lupulins. So when you look at this thing, it's fairly non-polar, although reasonably soluble in water, not terribly soluble. Okay, those are some OHs and some other things. The humulones all have one of these isoprene units on a leg. So I think of these as a little person, right? And it's got one or two legs at the bottom, and a couple of arms. This side chain comes from an amino acid. So leucine produces this one. So there's an enzyme that takes the side chain of leucine and puts it onto the humulone. And then there's one that does the same for valine. That compound's called cohumulone, isoleucine. You get adhumulone. So there's three of them, made from these three amino acids. The beta acids are the ones with two betas. Okay? Same story, but since you replace an OH with a non-polar group, these are much less soluble in water. They're really actually not very important. You can't dissolve enough of these to worry about. All right, so turns out that those compounds, I say, produce bitterness, but only after an isomerization occurs. Okay? So the compounds I've shown you do not have a bitter taste. You have to isomerize them, and then there's formulas that predict how much bittering compound you get when you boil so much for so long. Okay? Those are called international bittering units. Okay? So if you want a hoppy beer, order one with about 100 IBUs in it. If you want a not very hoppy beer, order one with 10. Okay? So when you go to Good People and they have their beers up there, they'll have alcohol percent and then the IBUs. Okay? I know some of you are looking at the alcohol percent, but look at the IBUs. It'll tell you how bitter it is. And there's kind of a theoretical limit of about 100. But anyhow, basically you have to isomerize this 6-member ring to a 5-member ring. Okay? This is much more soluble than that. So the reason you boil hops 60 minutes is to dissolve these slightly soluble compounds and to isomerize these involves breaking the chemical bond, high activation energy. You have to break the carbon-carbon bond with thermal energy. High activation energy, so it's very slow. You got to boil it 60 minutes to get any reasonable amount. But now you have something that's bitter. All right, so that's the traditional, natural way of brewing. All right. What about Frankenstein brewing? All right, so you can buy chemically modified hop resins. So instead of trying to extract these with boiling water and converting them, you know, maybe you can find a catalyst. Maybe you can do carbon dioxide supercritical CO2 extractions. Okay, it's not unnatural. All you're doing is just dissolving it with a different solvent. Okay, and CO2 is not really what most people think of as chemical. If you were to use something like methylene chloride as your solvent, then they might get worried. Okay, so just a side issue. You can decaffeinate coffee beans. So how do you do that? Well, you extract the caffeine, which is water soluble. If you do that, it's called the Swiss water process. Or you can extract it with methylene chloride, but people don't like that because what if there's a little bit left in my coffee bean? Right? Or you can use CO2, supercritical CO2. So most of the coffee decaffeination is done with supercritical CO2 now, but these companies don't throw away that caffeine. No, that goes to the Red Bull company. Right? So, you ever seen somebody says, I'll have decaf coffee and Red Bull? What's the point? All right, so here's the humulinic acid, the normal compound that you get from humulone isomerization produces bitterness in beer. All right, I want you to look at this double bond, this ketone, and this double bond. We're going to add hydrogens catalytically to those three. If you add it to reduce the ketone to the alcohol, that's called rho isoalpha acid. I don't know why it's called rho, that's it. If instead of reducing the ketone to the alcohol, you produce saturated from the double bonds with 4 hydrogens, right? It's tetrahydro isoalpha. And then you can do all 6, which is called hexahydro. These compounds, do not have these double bonds. It turns out that these double bonds are photochemically active. So if you take a hoppy beer, been produced by the natural way from hops, you put it in the bright sun, it's going to smell like a skunk when you open it. It's called skunked beer. Okay, so that means your beer should, if it's in a bottle, should be in a brown bottle, not a green bottle. You ever know some beer come in green bottles? Right? Those are the ones that get skunked if they're hoppy. So even if it's in a green bottle, if it came out of a box, it's probably okay, right? There's no light inside the box. There are other bottles on the market from a certain country that are clear, right? And actually, there were some American beers that were clear bottles. Miller, High Life, whatever. They came in clear bottles. That's because they were using these chemically modified, so they didn't have these photochemically active double bonds. Okay? So, different breweries do things in different ways. But that's why Corona doesn't skunk. Okay? So don't blame its bad flavor on skunk. Right? I kid. Some of them are bad. All right, so what about hop, aroma, and flavor? Those are mostly 10 carbon compounds called terpenes, monoterpenes. Right? And here's a whole bunch of them. If you wanted to count carbons, you can find out there's 10. But limonene is orange oil, menthene, camphene, pinene. You can guess what some of these things smell or taste like. So some hops are piney or resiny. Some are floral, like citral and geranic. Geraniol. Geraniol smells like geraniums. Right? And myrcene, I can't remember what that smells like. I think it's, well, I won't say. I forget. This is just a palette of what hop you select based on what kind of characteristic you want. If you want a kind of an evergreen, so maybe minty, you pick one of these hops. Spicy, floral, if you want something floral, fruity. There's a lot of the new hops are very characteristic of like melon and stuff like that. It's really quite surprising. You know, blood oranges and pears and cantaloupe, all sorts of weird ones. All right, so cool down to work. It's, you know, you got all your hop stuff in for all the flavors and bitterness you want. You got the sugar in there. Cool it down, add the yeast. Fermentation happens. That's a big complicated process and won't go into. But basically everything needs to be sanitary. The first thing I want to mention is the yeast does need oxygen. So the first thing you want to do is make sure your yeast are nice and healthy. So it spends the first 12 hours or so, maybe even a day, using aerobic respiration, which is very energy efficient, produces lots of ATP, builds up lots of different cells, buds off, makes lots of nice young yeast cells. Then when the oxygen runs out, it switches to fermentation and makes the alcohol. This is, I violated a rule, I relabeled the reagent bottle. This is rubbing alcohol. There's some dry yeast, you can see it bubbling. I just put it in warm water, you can actually see it works. This is called proofing. All right? So if you proof a bread, you see it rise, you know the yeast is alive. I use an iodine-based detergent called iodophor. It's very similar to that stuff they swab on your arm when you get a shot. There's the yeast and the cooled wort going in. And I use a kitchen sprayer. There's lots of air being entrained in a kitchen sprayer. If you ever look at your sink, there's this little screen mesh thing which puts a lot of air dissolved in your water as it goes out of the tap. This is a closed fermentation. I don't want to invite any outside organisms in. A lot of parts of the world, they do spontaneous fermentation. And be very careful about what's in the air around them. Certain breweries will not repair their ceilings or clean the cobwebs or nothing because they're afraid of the chainsaw. All right, so lagers ferment about 50 or so, ales about 70 or so. This is just a rough rule of thumb. And it's roughly about the temperature you drink. Drink ales kind of coolish, drink lagers very cold. All right, so once the fermentation is done, you've got to put it I think this was Tennessee.
Yes, sir.
Now, canning beer is a bit out of the homebrewer's reach. I just want to point out it's not been done very long. But there's a couple guys down in Auburn who started a brewery in Colorado called Oscar Blues. Those beers are really good and exceptional. And they proved that if you got bad beer out of the can, it wasn't the can's fault. Right? And so that's I got 5 of these in my house. I used to have 6. I don't know what happened. If you're going to be a beer judge, you got to learn how to isolate and say what that aroma or flavor is in there. Should it be there? You know, or is there something not there that should be there? All those sorts of comments are expected. And if you smell or taste something, you say, okay, what was that? I know I smelled it before. And, you know, it triggers maybe a memory, maybe it's just fuzzy. This help you look some words. Oh yeah, it's that. Okay. Oh yeah, it's banana rather than pineapple. All right, so I know you can't read it. Some of these words are not very good. Cooked cabbage. No. Celery. These are bad in beer. Right? Cooked vegetables bad. Now this is the skunk. This is the phototypical skunking reactions, which I won't go through. Okay, so I got about 4 or 5 more slides about what compounds in beer give certain flavors. Organic acids are bad. They're sour. Now in some beers, sour's okay, but certain sours are not okay. So vinegar, that's not so good. It's kind of overwhelming some beers. But it can be present in some beers. Blue cheese, that's kind of funky, footy. Butyric acid, some of the nastiest, foulest stuff you'll ever smell. This looks worse than that, but trust me, this is awful. Right? So if you ever smelled the butyric acid, you'll never forget it. So, and then of course, this smells like a goat. So if you want to know what hexanoic acid smells like, just go to a goat. Ask permission. All right, so all right, diacetyl. Remember I referenced my article on diacetyl? You can get diacetyl from a poor fermentation or from an infection. So basically, diacetyl is 2 acetyl groups, right? And so this comes from a pathway, acetolactate, that's produced as part of the valine synthesis. All right, so it turns out if the yeast tries to make a lot of valine, you get a lot of this produced as a side effect, and you'll have a buttery beer. Right? And it's very common that you actually may not be able to taste this compound, but you can feel it. What it will do to a hoppy beer is completely ruin your perception of hops. So if you order beer that you know is hoppy, it doesn't taste hoppy, it's just kind of, it's because somebody's got an infected beer line, probably. They need to clean their beer line. Okay, here's acetaldehyde. That's Granny Smith apple. That's what you would taste if you tried to drink beer after one day. Right? It's called green beer, and it tastes like Granny Smith. So there's only one way to describe it, and that's green. Which is appropriate for St. Patrick's. Dimethyl sulfide to cook corn. So remember I said cooked vegetable bad? Well, dimethyl sulfide is produced in the boiling wort, but it's driven off as you boil. But if your boiler's malfunctioning, you know, you got just a tiny little flame, you're not driving this stuff off, and you'll have a beer that tastes like canned corn. Right? So if you ever get a beer that tastes like canned corn, it may have been the brewer's. So lactic acid. So most sour beers that you might see on the market are mostly lactic. Lactic bacteria produce that. Right? German wheat beers have clove character. Phenols are generally nasty, except for this one. Higher alcohols are called butyl alcohols. So a lot of people blame headaches on consuming homebrew on these higher alcohols, they think, well, maybe it's the brewer's fault. Or maybe it's your fault for drinking 12. Right? It could be an ethanol headache. Because that's the main thing that happens is you drink too much alcohol. It gets converted up with the alcohol dehydrogenase to acetaldehyde, and that's what gives you the headache. It's the acetaldehyde that builds up in your body. Now, if you do this with wood alcohol, methyl alcohol, it gets converted to formaldehyde, which is what they use to pickle dead bodies with. And that's what's going to happen to your body if you drink wood alcohol. So, don't do that. But, so, just be aware, there are other alcohols besides ethyl alcohol. And then finally, the last slide on flavors is a lot of the fruity things are ester compounds. You've smelled esters in the lab by now, I'm sure. Ever smell any fruity things? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. You ever smell a banana? That's isoamyl acid. All right, so normally I give this talk to a bunch of people who have been drinking. So I have to show them this slide. And tell them that it will not work. All right. Now, this was on the internet long before there was any false news on the internet. So it's got to be true. All right. So anyhow, that's my talk. I'll be happy to answer questions.